Hey everyone, Matt from Crank Engineering, and we've had some questions in our private members forum about air compressors, and I just wanted to show you some of the features of an air compressor. This one's mine, and give you an idea of what you might look for if you're buying an air compressor for motorcycle work, and some of the features and benefits of some of the compressors on the market. So the whole purpose of an air compressor is to provide a supply of air to the tools that you're using that are driven by air. So and this particular one's got a tank and the compressor unit itself, and it's driven by an electric motor via a belt drive in behind this rear cover. So some of them are direct drive, so the motor runs directly to the compressor. The larger ones are generally a belt drive. So this particular one's 2.5 horsepower, and that's about as big a motor I can get and still run off a single phase GPO here in Australia, which is 240 volts, and 10 amps is the normal circuit rating for most appliances. So 10 amps and 240 volts gives me about 2.5 horsepower. So it's actually 9 amps on this particular motor, so it gives me 2.5 horsepower. So 2.5 horsepower motor, belt drive to the compressor. So the way this is generally supposed to work is this cutoff valve on the back of the compressor here is connected to the air supply in the tank via this short piece of tubing or pipework here. So it can see, or it can sense, the pressure in the tank. And these particular cutoff valves simply a switch that's driven by the air pressure in the tank, and it'll turn the motor on or off. So if the pressure falls below the set point, it'll turn the motor on, and then when it does that, it pumps up the tank, and when it gets to the cutoff pressure, this switch activates to turn the motor off. So generally, the problems I've only ever had with compressors have been related to this switch itself. So this guy controls the starting and the stopping. Generally, they're preset for you when you purchase them, especially if it's just a retail switch, but you can adjust them. I've never bothered. This works just fine out of the box for my compressor. So this guy starts and stops, drives the compressor itself. So this is really just like a very simple engine. It's got a couple of pistons and a crankshaft, and it literally is an air pump, and it pumps air via this line back into the tank. So there's a steel tank at the bottom here. This one I think is 55 litres. So it pumps this tank up, and when the pressure gets high enough, it just cuts out the switch. So as I'm using an air tool and it's consuming the air in this tank, the pressure is going to drop. So that's what starts and stops the compressor, is the consumption of the air via whatever air tool you happen to be using. So obviously a tool that uses a lot of air will drain the tank quickly, and the motor will have to cycle on and off more frequently to pump up the tank. So it really depends on the tools you're using. And I think in most cases a high velocity, low pressure spray gun is probably one of the most highest air consumption tools you might find in your own shop. Okay, so some of the other features on this particular compressor. So they are filled with oil, so they have an oil level, and this one's got a small sight glass here, and this is so that you can check the oil level in the bottom of the compressor. So it's refilled via this fitting here. I can unscrew that and top up the oil. This one's never needed it, and just recently I drained the oil and refilled it with brand new oil. So there is an air intake on this side of the compressor, so there is a filter here, just a bit like a dirt bike filter. So that's really what I do with mine. I clean mine in kerosene and then oil it. So that's the intake, and this is the exhaust of the compressor. This particular compressor is fitted with an aftercooler, and that's really just a radiator, really an air radiator, and that's designed to cool the air before it gets into the tank. So obviously this heats the air up because it squashes the air, so it increases the temperature of the air. So you get warm air inside this tank, and depending on your weather conditions in the place you live, you could draw quite a bit of moisture into this tank. So on just about every air compressor tank you'll see there'll be a fitting at the bottom of the tank to drain any moisture from the tank. So if you leave the moisture in the tank, a couple of problems you get is, one is that it gets drawn into your air, and if you're spraying paint, for example, you really don't want to be mixing water with it. And if you're blowing water through your steel air tools, like an air die grinder or a drill or something, you're going to wreck the tool pretty quickly if there's too much water in there. So you really need to keep the water level, well, water out of this tank. So you've got to drain them regularly, and that's pretty much before every use. And in some cases, if it's a really humid day outside, you may have to do that multiple times in a day, depending on how much air you draw into the tank. You also don't want air sitting inside this steel tank, because you'll rust the tank out from the inside out. So you really need to look after your tank and keep the moisture level, and we'll keep the moisture out of it. So a couple of other features on this particular compressor. I've got mine hooked up to a regulator at the front here, and that means I can adjust the delivery pressure to a particular level. So if I'm spraying, like paint spraying for example, I might want 90 psi, so I can set my regulator here. Mind you, if you're running a very long air hose, you're going to get a pressure drop in that hose, so sometimes it's better to have a regulator at the tool end, and I do have a setup like that where I can plug my tool directly into this regulator, and I've got a water trap here, and I can plug my air line in here at 120 psi, and I can regulate right at the tool, which is sometimes better if you've got a very long hose run from your compressor to your air tool. So another bit of gear that might be useful. And these compressors are also fitted with a couple of safety devices. One of them is on the back here. There's a relief valve. So if something failed on this cutout switch and the motor didn't stop when it was supposed to, what will happen is that safety relief valve it's just spring loaded, and then eventually the pressure will increase enough and it'll unseat the valve and it'll let the air escape out of the tank. So it really just is a safety feature, and I'm just going to lift the valve manually. There's a little pull ring on the top, so I can check that it's actually working. So I can release a bit of pressure, but I can also make sure that A, it will unseat, and B, when it closes, it seals and I can't hear any air escaping. So that's a pretty critical feature on your compressor, because if the shutoff valve fails and the relief valve fails to lift, then something else is going to let go at very high pressure. So you want to make sure those safety features are operational. And on this particular compressor, you can see the line coming out of the aftercooler and going into the tank in this location here. There's also a check valve fitted in this housing here. So I'm going to just drain the rest of the air out of this tank. So there's a check valve in this block here, which we're going to take out in a second, and its purpose is to prevent air escaping back through the compressor once the motor stops turning. So once this shuts down and the compressor stops moving, you don't have any more air pushing through into the tank. So the air is going to try and want to escape going backwards. So there's a check valve in here, and all it does is stops the air going in reverse. So I'm going to take it out to show you that particular check valve now. Okay, so it's very simple. There's just a spring and a rubber cap here, and the rubber cap seals against the fitting in the compressor and prevents the air going back out through the back of the compressor and escaping back to atmosphere and basically bleeding down your tank. So if your compressor stops and you hear air escaping, you can often find that something might be jammed under this valve and it's holding it off its seat and air's escaping past it. So if that does happen, this is very simple to take out. You can just give it a wipe, check the mounting face inside the valve, and just reassemble it, which is what I've done on a number of occasions. And that sometimes happens if you let the moisture build up, you get some rust inside the tank, and then the air dislodges the rust and blows it back into the air lines and it catches under the valve. So a couple of reasons for the maintenance of the tank as well. So the other thing I want to show you, and where I've had problems with my compressors, is there is a little black air line here, which you might be able to see in the second camera, and it runs right back through and back here to the cut-off valve, and you can see a little orange fitting here, and that's just a lock for an airline. And this is designed to unload the compressor when the compressor stops. So when the motor shuts down, the pressure in the head of the compressor is allowed to escape via the little valve that's inside this cut-off switch. So there's a little valve inside here, and this, all it does, it lets the air escape just out of the top of the compressor. So it's sensed through this line here, and it's on the other side of the check valve. So it's on the compressor side of the check valve. So the reason for that is if you left this full of compressed air, when the motor has to start, it's got to force itself against the compressed air inside the head of the compressor, and that draws a lot of current and is not good for motors. And if it draws too much current, it'll blow the circuit breaker in your electrical circuit. So you really want to unload the head of the compressor. And I found when I have problems with my compressor, it's generally that unloader valve, which is just a few bits of plastic. This is usually the thing that plays up. In the United States, you can buy these very cheaply, a few bucks. Here in Australia, I haven't been able to find them separately, and I have to buy a complete cut-off switch, which is around $60 to $80. So it's a bit annoying for a $5 fitting, but anyway. So they're the main features of a compressor. If you've got any other questions, drop them in the comments below. And if you're interested in our private members forum, just head over to crankengineering.com/community, and you can check it out there.